You don't get many surprises at Wolfe's brownstone, and that's just the way he likes it. Routine is king. At exactly 11:10 every morning, he heads up to the plant rooms. At 4 o'clock, he's down again, right on cue. And heaven help you if you interrupt him in either direction. So when the bell rang just after 10 on a Thursday morning, I figured it was one of our regular nuisances, maybe Inspector Kramer with indigestion, and an accusation, or Lon Cohen fishing for gossip masked as fact. What I didn't expect was a woman who looked like she'd just walked out of a black and white movie hat pinned perfectly, voice like burnt caramel, and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by charm. "I'm not here about a crime," she said, as if that made her less dangerous. "I'm here about a mistake." That's how they all start. She gave the name Elise Varney, which didn't ring a bell for me, and claimed she worked for Nero, a high-end fusion place down in Soho, where the duck costs more than my monthly wardrobe. Said she was the general manager, and one of her waiters, Claude Greaves, had just been fired and arrested for stealing a set of antique silver fish knives from a private party hosted by a hedge fund prince and his lady of the hour. The police hadn't blinked. The client had pressed charges. The waiter had gone quietly. Case closed. Only Elise didn't think Claude had done it. He's a little pompous, a little reckless, but he's not a thief. Not like that, she told me, setting her handbag down like it might explode if handled wrong. And frankly, I think this was planted, and I think someone very important wanted Claude out of the way. I let that hang in the air a minute, while she sipped the coffee Fritz had reluctantly brought in. She was watching me, trying to read whether she'd wasted her time. I admit, I was half tempted to let her walk out. Wolfe doesn't do restaurant politics. He doesn't even eat in them. I have no proof, she added quickly, only that it happened to fast. The whole thing was convenient for everyone but Claude. I asked her who had access to the party. She named for staffers to clients, and one PR consultant who apparently had influence and connections, the kind of person who shows up when bad things happen and walks out with clean shoes. At this point, I should have said, "Sorry, lady, this is out of our wheelhouse. Wolfe's not a public defender." But she pulled out a check already made out to Wolfe, not blank. $5,000, even if it's just to review the sequence of events. If he's guilty, I'll drop it. But if he's not, she left the sentence there, like an invitation to jump off a roof. I took the check up to Wolfe during his awkward time. He glanced at it and didn't say a word, just sniffed, handed it back, and said, "We shall speak at noon." That was that dot at noon. Elise came back. Wolfe stayed seated in his oversized chair, breathing like a man offended by air. He asked precisely 5 questions: what time the knives were discovered missing, who searched whom, who packed up the dining suite, what Claude had said when accused, and how the PR consultant and ex-food critic named Cyril Farr responded. When the police were called, she answered calmly, precisely, like she'd practiced. Wolfe listened, eyes half shut, hands forming a teepee on his belly. When she was done, he said, "I shall consider the matter." That was Wolfe speak for. "This interests me. though I won't admit it until I've digested it alongside Fritz's VLBLANQUETTE. After Elise left, Wolfe didn't return to the orchards. Instead, he summoned me to the office and said, "Mr. Goodwin, I expect you to dine at Nero this evening." I blinked. "You expect me to pay $100 to eat duck foam, so I can sniff out gossip from underpaid servers? I expect you to eat nothing. You are there to observe." Wolfe growled. "You shall speak with the remaining staff. You shall gauge their character, and you shall determine whether this Claude is being used as a scapegoat or a tool." I knew what that meant. Wolfe didn't take this case because he cared about the waiter. He took it because something about it itched at his brain. A theft to clean, a fall too fast, and maybe, just maybe, a crime too quiet to be accidental. I put on my cleanest suit, kissed my evening off goodbye, and made a reservation under a fake name. Nero, here I come. I hoped they served answers along with the amuse-bouche. The thing about pretending to be someone you're not is that it gets easier every time you walk through a door expecting to get caught. I showed up at Nero in a charcoal jacket and a name that didn't belong to me, something smooth and waspy that wouldn't raise an eyebrow. On a Thursday night, the host gave me a polite once-over and slid me toward a corner table, with enough privacy to eavesdrop without looking like I was trying. I ordered a seltzer and a look of distant interest, then watched the dance floor disguised as a dining room. Every server here moved like a chess piece, controlled, precise, and ready to sacrifice someone else for the king. The waiter who took my drink order was a short-haired guy with sleeve tattoos that peaked just below his uniform cuffs. Polite enough, but distracted. His name tag said Marcus. When he brought my glass, I asked, "Claude used to work here, right?" His jaw clenched, but he nodded. "That whole thing bad break." "Yeah." I leaned in slightly. "Was he dirty or just unlucky?" Marcus paused. "Depends who you ask." He didn't say more, but the words had weight. He glanced toward the bar, where a tall, lean man in a double-breasted suit was laughing a little too loudly with a woman wearing pearls, and a bored expression. That, I learned later, was Cyril Farr, the PR guy who'd become a minor celebrity for making restaurants look expensive enough to scare you off before you saw the menu. Elise hadn't exaggerated. He had influence, and he wielded it like a stiletto. When Farr stepped away to answer a call, I used the window to chat up the bartender, who turned out to be a moonlighter named Tessa. She didn't know who I was, but when I played the curious diner angle and mentioned Claude, she gave me the kind of sit-along glance that usually comes before a confession or a lie. "He was a little cocky," she said, drying a glass. "Thought he had immunity because the owner liked him. But that night, he just wasn't himself. Jumpy. Kept checking the VIP table like something was about to happen. Did anything? Yeah. $100,000 dinner went sour when the knives vanished, and the cops were here before anyone had dessert. I left her with a big enough tip to buy discretion and slipped out before Farr could notice me. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, looking like a man meditating on algebra. I gave him the rundown. He asked one question. Was the woman bored? I blinked. You mean Far's date? Yes. Describe her. Blonde. Mid-30s. Designer everything. Looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. He nodded slowly, as if I'd just confirmed something he hadn't yet shared. That's when Fritz entered, not with dinner, but with a face like he'd been asked to serve canned soup. Mr. Wolfe, he said softly, I believe someone has tampered with the kitchen inventory. Wolfe sat up 2 degrees straighter. Explain. One of the spice containers, the cubeb pepper, has been emptied and filled with white flour. The label was carefully reattached. Cubeb isn't common. Wolfe uses it in precisely to dishes. Fritz wouldn't confuse it for anything else. Wolfe didn't speak for a full 20 seconds. Then he looked at me. This confirms it. We are not merely examining an injustice. We are trespassed upon. It didn't matter that the spice swap might have happened days earlier. Someone had stepped into Wolfe's sanctum. And that, my friend, is how you move the immovable. We had a waiter in jail, a restaurant staff giving off whiffs of panic, a silverware scandal that smelled manufactured, and now a deliberate tampering in the heart of the brownstone. That was no coincidence. Someone had just rung a bell in Wolfe's mind, and there would be no silence until he answered it. Now he was in, not for justice, not for truth, for control. And I had a feeling this case would take more than a dinner reservation and a spice jar to unravel. It was just past 9 a.m. The next morning, when I walked into the office carrying a legal pad and a list of names scribbled from memory and napkins, Wolfe was in his chair, bathed in the golden light from the west window like a smug Buddha who'd won a courtroom debate. Without saying a word, I handed him the list. For key staffers who were working that night, all close enough to the knives and the chaos to be useful, all still employed, and a fifth your favorite Cyril Farr, the PR man with the talent for appearing innocent and making others look guilty. He glanced at the paper and set it on the edge of his desk with 2 fingers like it might stain the would. Speak. I sat. Marcus Reams, server, bit of a grudge holder, judging by his expression. Used to work with Claude, didn't seem sorry he was gone. Disgruntled, Wolfe folded his hands. Proceed. Tessa Bell, bartender, more open, but wary. Said Claude was jittery that night, checking on the VIPs, especially Farr, and his date. Claimed she saw the whole thing spiral as soon as dessert was ordered. Does she favor Mr. Greaves? She favors a quiet night and a big tip. Third is Myla Trent, hostess, keeps things tight. No visible emotions, no leaks. Wouldn't talk to me beyond I wasn't there when it happened. She was an obvious liar, the worst kind. 4th chef, Romulo Cortez, big guy, arms like flour sacks, doesn't trust outsiders, called Claude ambitious. That can mean a compliment or a warning in kitchen speak. And Mr. Farr, Wolfe's voice sharpened slightly, still there, still floating from table to table with a grin and a whisper. I didn't get close, but I heard him talk to one of the clients, said something about controlling the narrative and not letting this turn into another Pharaoh incident. Wolfe's eyelids narrowed. Pharaoh? I shrugged, digging into it. He exhaled slowly. Very well. Assemble them. Tomorrow evening. Here. I leaned forward. You won't need to bring 5 restaurant staff and a PR tycoon into your house for finger sandwiches. And confessionals, of course not. Fritz will prepare an appropriate collation. The purpose is not nourishment, but pressure. Sure, that'll be easy. Hi, I'm the guy who was pretending to be a customer. Would you care to join me at a strange brownstone with a giant man who won't stand up but might accuse you of theft? You may embellish, you may threaten, you may even promise dinner, but they will come. Wolfe was already reaching for the bell to summon Fritz when I stepped out. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and vengeance. The next 24 hours were spent crafting invitations that read less like summonses and more like golden tickets dipped in menace. I called Nero and pretended to be with a food magazine. I suggested we were doing a retrospective on the night the knives vanished and wanted first-hand quotes for a feature piece. That would soften the PR edges. Farr took the bait. First, said he'd be delighted to provide context and correct the public perception. I didn't tell him Wolfe already believed the perception was too clean to be real. Marcus took a little more effort. I had to suggest that the article might help Claude's reputation, which he didn't care for. But he wanted his side recorded. Tessa was easy curious and cautious, but not above a bit of drama. Myla refused twice, but after I hinted Farr had already agreed, she folded. Chef Cortez didn't respond at all until I caught him during a smoke break and said Wolfe might be writing a book about famous kitchen betrayals. That got him thinking. So, 5 guests. Thursday evening. Wolfe didn't raise his voice, but I could feel his pulse behind every instruction. He told Fritz what to prepare, told me how to seat them, and told Theodore in the plant room not to expect him until this matter was resolved. Thursday arrived with clouds, a real Neuer sky. They showed up between 7 and 7:30, one by one, in varying degrees of suspicion and polish. Farr wore a linen jacket and a grin. Myla arrived with her coat buttoned like armor. Marcus came in slouched, hands in his pockets. Tessa tried to make small talk with Fritz. Cortez said nothing but nodded once. Wolfe didn't greet them until they were all seated in the office, their drinks on coasters, their discomfort thickening like stew. Ladies and gentlemen, Wolfe began without standing. This is not a court. It is not a pageant. It is not even a restaurant. You are here because a man has been accused of theft, and I suspect the truth has been cooked, garnished, and served with garnish. Farr chuckled softly. We're cooperating, aren't we? Wolfe looked at him like he was a fly on a souffle. Your cooperation is appreciated. Your motive is yet unknown. That landed like a dropped fork. Silence. Wolfe went on. One of you knows precisely how the knives were removed. One of you acted, or assisted, or permitted. And one of you shall find this evening quite uncomfortable. Myla shifted. Cortez scratched his neck. Tessa looked at her glass. Wolfe raised a finger. Before we begin, Mr. Goodwin, please describe what was done to the cubeb pepper. They looked confused. Farr blinked. I'm sorry, Myla said. A separate matter, Wolfe said, serene, yet relevant. Something was tampered with in this house. It confirms the presence of someone who wanted more than a distraction. Marcus's jaw twitched, Farr stopped smiling. Wolfe's voice dropped half an octave. Now, let us discuss the night in question. Not the event, but the sequence. From memory, Mr. Cortez. You first. And just like that, the performance began not with shouting or fingerprints, but with timelines, tones, and tiny contradictions. Wolfe was peeling the onion layer by silent layer, and none of them knew yet who'd cry first. You'd think people who work in restaurants would be better at keeping their stories straight. After all, half their job is reciting fake pleasantries while juggling real chaos. But as Wolfe went around the room, drawing out their versions of that night at Nero, I kept noticing the same thing. They were all a little too polished, a little too ready, not quite rehearsed, but close, and not one of them gave the same timeline twice. That meant somebody was covering tracks. The trick now was figuring out whose tracks were to clean. The next morning, Wolfe had barely touched his breakfast. I know because I was halfway through my eggs when he said, "You will revisit Miss Bell and Mr. Reams. Be thorough. Begin with the bartender." That was Wolfe speak for. Someone cracked a scene last night, and I want you to hammer it open. So I went back to Nero, this time with no fake names and no pretense of eating. I caught Tessa just as she was finishing up prep behind the bar. She had a towel over one shoulder and a face that looked like she hadn't slept well. When I introduced myself properly this time, she raised an eyebrow but didn't tell me to get lost. "Thought you looked familiar," she said. "So you're not with a magazine?" Depends on the issue," I replied. "This month. It's crime and confession." She smirked. "Claude's case again. Always was. Wolfe doesn't take cases to pass the time. Something stinks. And it's not the duck confit." That got a small laugh. "I already told you what I saw." "Maybe. But let's pretend I'm an idiot. Walk me through it again, everything you remember from that night. Especially what happened after the party got started." She sighed and leaned on the bar. "All right. I started my shift at 5. Claude was already here, pacing by the espresso machine like someone had stolen his tips. Myla had the guest list, and Farr was swanning around like he owned the place. We had one big table in the back, 8-people private event. Fancy, quiet. Claude was their server. Around 7:30, Myla came over and told me to start prepping the bar cart for table service. Weird, because we don't usually do that. But I figured, hey, maybe someone wanted to show off who gave the cart to Claude. Myla, she wheeled it out herself. Claude followed her. About 10 minutes later, all hell broke loose. Chef starts yelling from the kitchen that the knives are missing. Farr's already on the phone with somebody, and Claude's standing there, pale, saying he never left the table. Did anyone see him leave the room? No one's admitted it. Marcus said he left to get water, but he didn't see anything. Myla claimed she went to the coat closet, also saw nothing. You ask me, someone timed it perfectly. What do you mean? Claude had a blind spot, always trying to impress Farr. wanted to get into event planning. Said he was working on a side hustle. Farr told him he'd help. Maybe that made him a target. Maybe it made him a mark. That was a fresh thread Claude's ambition. Wolfe had sniffed out the scent of manipulation. This could be leverage. I thanked her and left her to her polishing. Next, Marcus, he was less amused to see me, took a cigarette break just to avoid having to talk in front of anyone. "You guys still digging into this?" he asked, voice low and annoyed. "Until we hit something solid," I said. "Tell me again about the night Claude got fired." He shrugged. "I already did." "Do it again. Humor me." He hesitated, then sighed. "Fine." Claude was on edge. Said Farr was putting him in touch with a client, whatever that meant. But Farr's a snake. Always has been. He strings people along. Me, I was assigned a different section. Didn't even go near that back table until cleanup. All I remember is Farr pointing fingers and Myla acting like she was ready to toss Claude under a bus without asking questions. Why would she do that? Because she's protective of the place. Thinks keeping it scandal-free will get her a managing partner title one day. You ask me. If something went wrong, she'd throw anyone under the rug. Claude. Me. You. Saw her give Claude the bar cart. Not directly. I saw her push it through the kitchen doors. Didn't think twice about it at the time. And Cortez didn't come out till the shouting started. He's got tunnel vision. Could have marched an elephant through the dining room and he'd have missed it. If he was prepping lamb, it didn't add up. Farr was the only one who didn't get his hands dirty. Myla controlled logistics. Claude got blamed. The knives disappeared somewhere in between. And now Wolfe's spice rack had been tampered with by someone who knew enough to disguise it well. But not so well that Fritz wouldn't notice. I reported back around 6 p.m. Dumped the info in Wolfe's lap while he sipped beer with 2 fingers on the glass like it might bite him. He listened without interrupting, which was usually a bad sign. It meant he was deep in his own mental fog. And I was just the guy holding a flashlight. When I finished, he nodded. "There is a hierarchy here, Mr. Goodwin. Ambition is the lever. Influence the fulcrum. What remains is the motive." Claude was climbing, I said. Farr was dangling the rope. Myla wanted the rope cut. Then we must determine who tied the knot. That was Wolfe's way of saying, we need to find the setup, not just the setup artist. Then he surprised me. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will visit Mr. Farr. He will expect you. You will ask about the Ferro incident." I blinked. "You're sending me to a PR guy to ask about an unsourced disaster that may or may not be real?" "Yes, and you will watch his eyes." I didn't argue. Farr was the kind of man who polished his lies before breakfast and practiced his damage control in the mirror. But if Wolfe thought his vanity would trip him, I'd happily hold the mirror. The next morning, I met Farr at a cafe in Tribeca that probably charged rent for table space. He wore a coral scarf and an expression that screamed curated indifference. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, sipping from a glass of something green and overpriced. "To what do I owe the drama?" I wanted to follow up. "You mentioned a Ferro incident." He stiffened just slightly. but enough for Wolfe to be right. Oh, that? Just a mess at another launch event, he said smoothly. A bad hire. Nothing legal. Knives go missing at that one too. He blinked, then smiled. No, just trust. But you know how rumors spread. He paid the bill before I could press him harder. Wolfe was already in the office when I returned. I gave him the look, the words, and the pause Farr had made. He was rattled, I said. More than he wanted to admit. Wolfe closed his eyes. Then we are close. One final adjustment. Saul Panzer, calling him in. Yes, he must. Find Ferro. That was Wolfe's real game. Farr had tried to bury something, and Wolfe was about to dig it up with Saul's shovel. If Wolfe brings Saul Panzer into the picture, you can bet your beer money something's about to surface. Saul doesn't wear a badge, but he could out-investigate half the department with one hand tied behind his back and the other in his coat pocket. Discreet, surgically precise, and allergic to theatrics. Saul is Wolfe's scalpel when my hammer won't do the trick. Wolfe had called him in that morning with one simple instruction. Find Ferro. That was it. No first name, no location, no job title. Just a surname whispered by a slick PR man with a coral scarf and a reflexive lie. Wolfe didn't need details yet. He needed presence who this Ferro was, where he had vanished to, and why Farr flinched at the mention. While Saul worked the shadow grid, Wolfe sent me back to the kitchen, not Merrow's, ours. Fritz had made a list of every spice container on the shelf, with notes on weight, scent, and texture. Wolfe wanted them all rechecked. He wasn't just looking for signs of intrusion anymore. He was building a profile of whoever had dared to tamper with his house. It must be someone with both access and confidence, Wolfe said, and someone who understands the value of misdirection. That narrows it down to 3 people and 1 sociopath. I muttered. He ignored that. By mid-afternoon, I had checked 23 jars. All were normal except for the cubeb, of course, which still sat off to the side like evidence in a courtroom. Then I opened the fenugreek. The lid was tight, the seal broken just slightly, and inside, nothing. Not a speck, just a faint trace of powder along the bottom. Fritz hadn't noticed because he hadn't used it in over a week, but Wolfe knew. The difference between a misplaced ingredient and a missing one. I carried the jar into the office like a lit fuse. Another, I said. This one's not replaced. It's just gone. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward it, and no visible substitution. Clean. Wiped, like they knew what they were doing. That is not a prank, he said. That is a message. What kind? One meant to suggest that I am not the only one watching closely. I sat. You think this is about more than Claude. I think the incident at Merrow is not the beginning. It is the echo of a longer game, which is Wolfe speak for. We've walked into something already in motion, and the players are a few moves ahead. At exactly 6:10 that evening, Saul returned. He came through the door with the kind of quiet urgency that only meant one thing: he'd found what we needed. Ferro's name is Alison Ferro. She used to run a boutique hospitality group. Out of Midtown organized elite dinners, high-end catering, secret tastings, all whisper campaign stuff. 2 years ago, she had a spectacular falling out with Cyril Farr. Spectacular? Wolfe asked. Saul nodded. There were lawsuits, non-disclosures. She accused him of sabotaging one of her biggest events by planting stolen jewelry in her sous chef's prep bag. Cops never pressed charges, but the damage was done. She shut down her company 3 months later. Last I traced her, she was living in Queens, working freelance under an alias. Wolfe inhaled. Slowly. What was the event? Private dinner for a gallery opening. Client was a South American collector anonymous. Same type Farr caters to now. Same circles. So this was a dry run, Wolfe murmured. The waiter was a proxy then, as Claude is now. Pharaoh refused to talk directly. Saul added, but she sent this. He handed over a folded sheet of stationery. Wolfe didn't touch it. I opened it instead. For words. He uses the ambitious. That was all. But it rang loud. Wolfe looked at me. We now know his pattern. Frame someone hungry. Point the finger. Keep the spotlight moving. Precisely. And he counts on people to defend themselves poorly. Claude didn't defend himself at all, because he believed Farr could still save him. That is the measure of manipulation. I paced the office, the pieces starting to fit. Farr had orchestrated scandals twice, both times with rising professionals desperate to move up. Both times, the theft happened under his nose. Both times, someone else took the fall. And now he's tampered with your house. Wolfe's mouth curved just slightly, which was his second error. I blinked. Second? The first was believing I would not notice. Wolfe rang for Fritz and requested the list of recent deliveries. He wanted every package, every visitor, cross-checked if Farr had sent someone or something into the brownstone. It would have come wrapped in courtesy. While Fritz combed through records, I went back to Farr. This time, I didn't pretend. I walked into his office on 5th Avenue without an appointment and sat across from his assistant, a platinum-haired man who looked like he'd been sculpted from sarcasm. I need to speak with Mr. Farr, I said. He's not available. He will be. He gave me a smirk that would have wilted a daffodil. If you'd like to leave a message, sure. Tell him Archie Goodwin knows about Pharaoh. Tell him Wolfe is watching. And tell him the spices are gone. That wiped the smirk. He disappeared into the back, and 5 minutes later, Farr appeared. Himself jacket off, hair slightly disheveled. What is it you want? He asked, too quickly. A list of everyone who had access to the Nero kitchen that night, including delivery staff, private guests, and your PR crew. You can't just. Wolfe can, and he will, unless you prefer we loop in the DA. His lips thinned. Fine, but this is harassment. No, it's foreplay, he handed over a typed list with the kind of forced calm that usually hides something ugly. I took it back to Wolfe. He reviewed it slowly, pausing only once. This name, Lewis sent. I checked. Freelance sommelier, assigned by Farr, never met Claude. And yet, he also signed for a package that was delivered to this house last week. I stopped breathing for half a second. What package? A rare Riesling from Alsace, unrequested. I assumed it was a thank you, from Farr, unlabeled. But now, clearly entry. Far sent in scent to plant something, or to observe, or to unsettle. In either case, he has trespassed, and there it was, the link. Far had used a hired wine expert to breach Wolfe's inner sanctum under the guise of a gift, just like he used Claude, just like he used Pharaoh's sous chef, different tools. Same blueprint. Wolfe rose only slightly, but enough for the chair to creak. Tomorrow evening, Mr. Goodwin, you will invite Mr. Farr and Mr. Scent to dine with us. Mr. Fritz will prepare the Riesling. I shall prepare the confrontation. And I knew then the knives weren't the real theft. They were the bait. Farr hadn't just stolen from a restaurant. He'd walked into Wolfe's world and tried to rearrange the pieces. Now Wolfe was setting the table. By the next afternoon, the brownstone was less a house and more a pressure chamber, with Fritz as its culinary engineer, and Wolfe as the silent force compressing everything toward rupture. When I handed Wolfe confirmation that both Cyril Farr and Louis Scent had accepted the invitation sent more nervously than Farr, he didn't nod, didn't speak, didn't gloat. He simply removed his reading glasses, set them on the desk, and whispered, "It will do." The dinner was scheduled for 7:30 sharp. Fritz prepared duck eel orange with celery root puree, and yes, the Alsatian Riesling was chilled and displayed with silent sarcasm. I handled the seating chart per Wolfe's orders sent to Wolfe's left, Farr to the right, and me across the table in case anything needed interpreting into layman's terms. No one else was invited. Wolfe wanted intimacy, cornered intimacy. They arrived 2 minutes apart, Scent first, hesitant, carrying a small leather notebook under his arm, and the look of a man who had Googled his host. Twice on the ride over, Farr followed like a breeze through expensive cologne, confident, tailored, and still wearing the same dismissive grin he'd shown when I first walked into Nero. He kissed Fritz's compliment to the chef without tasting it. Wolfe didn't speak during the first course. He let the food settle and the Riesling breathe. He let Farr get comfortable, let Scent loosen up. Then, halfway through the meal, Wolfe struck not with a knife, but with a sentence so casual it could have been mistaken for weather talk. "Mr. Scent, have you ever planted a listening device in a house you didn't own?" Scent froze, fork halfway to his mouth. Farr glanced over, blinked once. Scent set the fork down. I'm sorry." Wolfe's tone didn't change. "It's a yes or no question." "No," Scent said. "Of course not." "Then I shall rephrase. Have you ever accepted compensation from a third party to enter a client's private residence under false pretenses?" Farr shifted in his chair. "This is outrageous. Louis is here as a guest." "I won't sit." "You will," Wolfe said, voice still velvet, but now with a weight that could crush glass. Mr. Scent signed for a package addressed to me. That same name appears on a staff list you provided attached to a night during which a fabricated theft resulted in a young man's arrest. Either this is coincidence of the rarest order, or Mr. Scent is more than a sommelier. Scenty's face had gone as pale as the napkin he was twisting beneath the table. "I only did what Mr. Farr asked. It was supposed to be harmless. That pulled the air out of the room like a vacuum." Farr didn't blink. Lewis, be careful. No. Sent said, I should have never agreed. I didn't know the full story. He said it was for a report and assessment of ambience, of security impressions. He said you were difficult and paranoid, and that he wanted leverage. Wolfe sipped his Riesling. He was not wrong on either count. But I am also precise. Sent continued, words tripping out now. He gave me a vial. I didn't know what was in it. He told me to spill it into your spice cabinet, just one jar. Said you'd notice. Said it would destabilize you, make you question things. I leaned forward. Which jar? Cubeb pepper. Farr finally spoke. Calm, smooth. You realize how absurd this sounds. Lewis is a junior contractor. He misunderstood. This was not sabotage. It was a sensory marketing test. You have no proof it was anything more. On the contrary, Wolfe said, I have absence, missing fenugreek, altered cubeb, Senti's admission, and now your strategy laid bare. He turned to me. Mr. Goodwin, summon Saul Panzer. That's when Farr lost his poise. Let's not turn this into theatre, he said. Voice sharp. Wolfe's eyes never moved. This is no performance. You are merely unaccustomed to consequence. Saul was waiting in the front room. He entered quietly, a folder in hand. Mr. Wolfe, he said, I've obtained records from Ms. Farrow's former events company, including internal messages and vendor correspondences. It's all there. Farr orchestrated the incident she referenced, same blueprint as Claude's. Farr looked at Sent. You idiot. Wolfe raised a hand. Language will not salvage. You. He turned to Farr. You needed Claude gone not because he posed a threat, but because he knew too much. You groomed him. You offered him promotion. You used him as bait. And when Elise Varney began asking questions, you decided to reroute the tension onto me. Farr said nothing. Your scheme was brilliant, Wolfe continued, twice executed. But it suffered from the flaw all manipulations share. It depended on silence. Farr stood. You can't prove intent. No, Wolfe said, rising slowly, deliberately. But the court of professional consequence is not as forgiving as a judge's bench. I will provide my findings to Elise Varney. I will provide them to Ms. Farrow. And I will send a copy to every executive in your client list. Farr was sweating now. You wouldn't. I would. Because the only thing I find more distasteful than theft, Wolfe said, is cowardice masquerading as power. Farr left without another word. Sent apologized 6 times before slipping out. Wolfe sat back down and rang for coffee. I stared across the table. Well, I said. That escalated. He didn't answer. He was already composing the letter in his head. Justice in the brownstone didn't always come with handcuffs. Sometimes it came with cold wine and ruined reputations. The next morning, the brownstone was quiet, almost ceremonial. Wolfe took breakfast alone, an unusual deviation from our unspoken routine. Fritz, picking up on whatever frequency Wolfe broadcast in his stillness, served him a soft-boiled egg, toast, and a folded newspaper, and left without asking questions. I didn't press either. Wolfe had work to do, not with facts or files, but with arrangement, positioning. He had already solved the case. Now he was threading it, needle to canvas, to make sure the picture stayed stitched together long after the culprits were gone. By 9 a.m., Wolfe summoned me to the office, where the air already carried the faint scent of the plant rooms and the sharper scent of calculation. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "we must determine who among the staff at Nero was knowingly complicit." "You mean besides scent? He was a tool, not a collaborator. There is a difference. Tools are disposable. Collaborators expect dividends. You think someone that Nero worked with far willingly? I think someone that Nero resented. Claude enough to assist his downfall. Not because they feared him, because they envied him." I exhaled. "Marcus, he is my candidate. All right, I'll go back. Rattle his cage." "No. Rattling is counterproductive. You will engage him. In public, create the illusion of proximity. Let it leak back to Myla Trent. Myla, she is Farr's next move. You removed his current agent. He will seek another." "That's a bold guess." "It is not a guess. It is strategy. Farr thinks in assets. Myla is a rising one." I got up to leave, then paused. "What's the play?" "You are the bait," he said simply. "Let them see you as messy, curious, alone." I nodded. My specialty. By late afternoon, I was at a small cafe 2 blocks from Nero. Marcus showed up 10 minutes after I sent him the casual invite, just enough delay to show he wasn't eager, but curious. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and stared at me like I might pull a badge from my coat. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, leaning back. "Conversation," I replied. "This case is a mess. Farr's probably going down. But Claude? He still might not get cleared unless someone vouches for him. Publicly." Marcus shifted in his seat. "You're asking me to stick my neck out?" "I'm asking you to be honest. Did he ever talk to you about Farr's offers, about getting promoted, about anyone pushing him to take a fall?" Marcus hesitated. He said Farr was vague, promised him exposure, that kind of crap. I figured it was smoke. "What about Myla?" He stiffened slightly. "She runs tight. She doesn't play games. Too fast." I leaned in. "She doesn't need to play games. She just has to pick the winner." He didn't answer, but the crease between his eyebrows deepened. "All right," I said, standing. "If you remember anything else, call me." I paid the bill, left my number scribbled on a napkin like a tabloid journalist, and made sure Myla saw me hand it off when I passed her on the sidewalk 5 minutes later. She didn't break stride, but I caught the glance. Wolfe was waiting in the office when I returned. "She saw you?" he asked, clear as day. "Then she will report it, and within 24 hours. Mr. Farr will initiate contact." "How? Do you know?" "Because you have now positioned yourself as a potential leak. Farr cannot abide unknowns. It didn't take 24 hours. That night, around 10 o'clock, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Meet me. 9 a.m. back entrance of Nero. Don't bring him. No name, no sign-off. But the style?" That was Myla. The next morning, I showed up in jeans and a jacket, and leaned against the brick wall near the kitchen delivery entrance. At 9:03, Myla opened the door and stepped outside, looking both ways before speaking. "You're not as clever as you think," she said flatly. "Try me," I replied. "Far isn't the problem. He's part of it." She folded her arms. "You don't understand how this industry works. There are no clean hands. There's just who gets caught." I nodded. "And who gets paid?" Her eyes narrowed. "You helped Farr frame Claude," I said. "You moved the knives. You chose the cart." She didn't respond. "You positioned Claude to take the fall so Farr could keep his clients happy." Why? Because Claude was weak. He wasn't ready. He would have ruined everything. Or maybe he was just in the way. Her silence said, "Enough." I let the moment stretch. "You're not his victim. You're his intern." She walked back inside without another word. I went straight to Wolfe. "She admitted nothing," I said, "but she gave everything." Wolfe sat with eyes closed. "She will be contacted again by Farr," he said. "He needs someone on the inside. Now more than ever. And now she's proven her worth. Should we call the police? No. That will come later. First, we pull the curtain." He rang for Fritz. "Another office gathering," he said. "This time, all of them, Myla, Marcus, Tessa, Cortez, Farr again, if he dares, and Miss Varney, Elise. She deserves closure. Will she come?" "She will. Tell her we are ready to return what was stolen, not the knives, the truth." By the time I made the calls, word had spread. Farr was on sabbatical. Myla was still showing up to work, but with tension in her shoulders. Marcus texted to ask, "Should I be worried?" I replied, "Yes." The guests arrived that evening. Just past 7. Wolfe had the chairs arranged not in rows, but in a semicircle like a tribunal with no judge, only judgment. When Elise walked in, she didn't smile. She sat beside me, calm, still, watchful. Wolfe waited until they were all seated before speaking. "You have all played a role in something that was never about cutlery," he said. "Claude Greaves is still in custody. His career, reputation, and freedom are in question. And yet none of you have demanded resolution." Marcus shifted. Tessa looked down. Myla met his gaze without blinking. "Tonight, I offer you an opportunity," Wolfe said, "to explain not for him, for yourselves." No one moved. "Very well. I shall explain for you." And then, piece by piece, he laid it out. The planted knives, the altered spice jar, the repeated blueprint from the Ferro case, Senti's admission, Farr's pattern, Miller's silence. By the time he finished, no one argued. When Elise spoke, her voice was low but sure. "I want Claude released. Immediately." Wolfe nodded. "He will be. Mr. Panzer has already provided the necessary documentation to his attorney. The DA will be briefed in the morning." The guests left quietly. Myla last. No words. Just a long look at Wolfe, like she'd underestimated. The one man who couldn't be steered. When they were gone, Wolfe rang for brandy. "I believe," he said softly, "we may finally eat in peace." When Wolfe says one final gathering, it doesn't mean parlor games and polite refreshments. It means judgment, calm, complete, and often brutal judgment, served not with gavel bangs, but with sentences so surgically placed that the guilty realize too late they've been dissected. And this time, he had every piece he needed: the motive, the method, the players. Now, it was about audience, not for Wolfe's sake, for theirs. The office was set up like it always was for the big finish. Wolfe at his desk in his custom-made chair, me to his right with a yellow legal pad I didn't need, and the guests arranged in a half-moon of discomfort. I could tell the temperature of the truth just by how they entered. Tessa came in quietly, unsure whether she was a bystander or a co-conspirator. Marcus followed, trying to look bored and failing. Cortez arrived smelling faintly of bay leaves and pride, arms folded like a defensive lineman. Myla arrived last of the Nero staff, face composed, eyes unreadable. And then Elise Varney, who said nothing but took a seat like a silent verdict. She was the one with the most at stake and, at this point, the least to prove. Wolfe let the silence hang for a full 20 seconds after the door shut. No one coughed, no one moved. Even Fritz stayed outside the room, understanding that this wasn't a social hour. At 7:15 p.m. on the evening in question, Wolfe began. A bar cart was wheeled into the private dining suite at Nero. It was wheeled by Miss Myla Trent and assumed to be intended for guest service. The cart carried wine, utensils, a polished water decanter, and a hollow compartment fitted beneath the shelving panel. That compartment contained the stolen cutlery. Marcus flinched. Cortez blinked. Myla didn't react. Moments after the service began, Claude Greaves was accused of theft. Wolfe continued. The knives were found in his locker. The police were summoned, and Mr. Farr made sure the incident remained discreet, framed as an unfortunate security breach. But there was no security breach. There was a narrative. Elise leaned forward slightly. I could feel her breath stilling. That narrative required for things, Wolfe said. 1. A scapegoat who could not defend himself without alienating his patrons. 2. Staff members who would remain silent either from fear or from ambition. 3. A manager willing to substitute loyalty for image control. And 4. A director off-site, but omnipresent, willing to trespass to protect his playbook. He turned his head just slightly. Miss Trent. Now Myla blinked. You told no one the knives had been moved to the prep station prior to service. You told no one you were the one who instructed Claude to fetch the extra wine the moment, which removed him from the cart. You claimed you were in the courtroom when the theft occurred, but records indicate you signed off on the kitchen manifest at the same moment. A contradiction that doesn't prove. Mr. Cortez, Wolfe interrupted, turning. You insisted Claude was ambitious. You claimed you stayed in the kitchen during service. Yet your sous chef testified to your absence for 3 full minutes, the exact window in which the bar cart re-entered the kitchen. Why? I stepped out for a call, Cortez said gruffly. We had a supply issue with Farr's wine distributor, whom you haven't ordered from in months. Cortez fell silent. Wolfe turned to Marcus. Mr. Reams, you stated you saw nothing, but your initials appear on a service report verifying the presence of the bar cart in the dining Sweet before Claude returned, a cart you denied seeing. I don't remember. You remember. You were paid to forget. Marcus dropped his gaze. Wolfe lifted a single page from his desk. This is a letter, a resignation letter, written by Mr. Farr to be signed by Claude Greaves after the incident. It includes a clause admitting guilt and requesting that no charges be pressed. The letter was found on Mr. Farr's cloud storage, time-stamped the morning before the event. Elise let out a small gasp. That was all. Wolfe placed the letter down. Miss Trent, you were approached 2 weeks prior with an offer, promotion, future ownership potential. Farr promised you status if you assisted in removing Claude. Why? Miller's mouth opened, then closed. I've worked 10 years for this, she said finally. I gave everything to that restaurant. Claude was reckless. He bragged. He cut corners. He wasn't careful. He wasn't complicit, Wolfe said. He was exploited. By Farr. And by you. The silence held. Then Elise stood. You destroyed a man's career, she said, so you could manage tablecloth budgets. Miller looked at her. You don't understand what it's like trying to get ahead in that business. No, Elise said. But I know what it's like to keep your integrity while trying. Wolfe didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he addressed the room one final time. I have submitted a report to the district attorney's office. Claude Greaves will be exonerated within 48 hours. Farr's reputation has already begun to erode. Miss Farrow has agreed to testify if needed. Saul Panzer has submitted supporting evidence. This office will issue no further comment unless contacted by legal counsel. He folded his hands. You may go. One by one, they left. Miller first, lips thin, future uncertain. Marcus lingered, as if debating apology, then didn't offer one. Tessa left quietly. Cortez didn't meet Wolfe's eyes. Elise stayed until the rest had gone. Thank you, she said. I don't know how to repay. You have. Wolfe said. You remained loyal to someone undeserving of silence. That is sufficient. She nodded once, then left. When the door finally clicked shut, Wolfe exhaled not from exhaustion, but from closure. The chessboard had cleared. The pieces were reset. I poured myself a small glass of Fritz's brandy and leaned against the door. You know, I said, you could have just told Claude to sue. Wolfe didn't look up. Justice is not served by lawyers. It is served by facts and veal. Veal assists, he said. I raised my glass to the spice thief. He lifted his. To the coward who miscalculated taste. The next day broke grey and steady, like the last hour of a thunderstorm calm, but charged. Inside the brownstone, the storm had already passed. Wolfe had done what he always did, let others talk themselves into their own undoing, then sat quietly and rearranged the pieces until the picture made itself visible. But the full reveal Wolfe's true conclusion, the complete structure of the crime, and the hidden levers behind it was still pending. That was Wolfe's final ritual, not just to win, but to explain how he won, and to remind everyone why he always does. The setting for the final confrontation was Wolfe's office, naturally. The scent of orchids filtered faintly in from the plant rooms, and the air was still. Like a held breath, Fritz had prepared tea, but Wolfe barely touched it. He sat with hands folded and eyes closed, while I stood beside the bookshelves, watching the guests file in one last time. This wasn't an open invitation. This was a curtain call. Cyril Farr arrived first, dressed more defensively than usual. Darker tones, less flair, no scarf. He looked like a man who had been read his own obituary and wasn't sure who wrote it. Myla came. Next, crisp but cold. A woman waiting for someone to tell her whether her future was salvageable. Then Elise Varney, sitting straight-backed near the center of the room, her gaze fixed on Wolfe like she was waiting for a verdict from a higher court. Claude Greaves followed her into the room quietly. Recently released, charges dropped, uniform traded for a plain shirt and stiff shoulders. He looked like someone walking through his own life trying to make sure it still fit. The last to arrive was Saul Panzer, slipping in with a folder under his arm and a face like stone. Wolfe opened his eyes. Miss Varney, Mr. Greaves, Mr. Farr, Miss Trent, I have convened you for the explicit purpose of clarity, not interpretation, not speculation. Clarity. He shifted, just slightly, and continued. You all know the events. You all know the outcome. What remains is the mechanism. He reached for a small notepad, flipped it open, and read from it with the kind of precision that didn't allow for reaction. Claude Greaves was framed for the theft of antique silverware from a private client at Nero. The crime required precise choreography, movement of the knives, creation of opportunity, and placement of false evidence. Claude glanced around the room as Wolfe continued, unmoved. The operation depended on 4 pillars. The first, access, Miss Trent orchestrated, staffing, meal flow, and room assignments. It was she who selected Claude for the event, despite his prior disciplinary report one she herself filed. That was not coincidence. That was placement. Miller's face hardened, but she said nothing. The second, leverage. Mr. Farr groomed Claude with promises of advancement, event planning connections, and exposure. This was not investment. It was bait. Mr. Farr has a history of using such tactics, one confirmed by Ms. Ferrer, whose name he buried through legal maneuvering 2 years ago. Her case mirrors this one with alarming similarity. Farr shifted, arms crossed. The third, manipulation, Mr. Cortez, whose absence from the kitchen was explained by a phone call that was never placed, allowed the cart containing the knives to return, unexamined. He did not assist the frame directly, but he made no effort to stop it. Silence is complicity. Wolfe paused, but no one interrupted. His voice resumed with a sharper edge. The fourth, misdirection. After the knives were found, after Claude was detained, and after Miss Varney raised concern, Mr. Farr attempted to redirect scrutiny by violating the sanctity of this house. Claude looked up. Wait, what? Wolfe held up a second notepad. A package was sent to me. A bottle of wine, accompanied by a visit from one Mr. Lewis Sent. A sommelier not known to me, but linked directly to Mr. Farr's hospitality circle. Mr. Sent. Under Mr. Farr's direction, planted a tampering device within my spice cabinet. A small vial used to alter the contents of cubeb pepper. He set the pad down. This was not revenge. This was preemptive strategy, designed to suggest that if I discovered something in Mr. Farr's world, I could not be trusted to explain it accurately, that my own perception could be called into question, a false narrative, designed to undercut me in my own home. Claude looked stunned. He came after you. Wolfe nodded once. That, Mr. Greaves, is how far Mr. Farr was willing to go to protect his pattern? Farr finally spoke, voice cold but composed. You have no proof I authorized any such intrusion. Saul opened his folder. I retrieved communications between Farr and sent. Direct payment. Instructions. Code phrases. He handed the paper to Wolfe, who didn't bother reading it aloud. There is sufficient evidence. Wolfe said, to confirm motive, method, and execution. That is enough for civil liability, career consequences, and, should Miss Varney choose, formal complaint. Elise looked at Farr. Her expression wasn't angry, it was hollow, disappointed in a way that couldn't be fixed with apologies or explanations. You could have told me, she said quietly. You let Claude rot in a cell for a PR strategy. Farr didn't answer. Wolfe turned to Myla. Miss Trent, you believed Mr. Farr would elevate you. Instead, he discarded you the moment your role was exposed. If you have any intention of continuing in this industry, I suggest Kanda now. Myla said nothing for several seconds. Then, slowly, she turned to Claude. I didn't want you to get hurt. I thought I was securing my future. I thought you could weather it. You let them accuse me, Claude said, softly. You let them fingerprint me. I know, she whispered. Wolfe looked at her and spoke the final words like a closing bell. You did not err by ambition. You erred by believing that loyalty can be faked. He turned to Saul. Please escort Mr. Farr out. Saul nodded. Farr rose, glancing once more around the room, and left without speaking. When the door closed, Wolfe looked at Claude. Your name will be cleared, your charges expunged. Whether your career recovers is no longer a matter for detectives. Claude exhaled. Thank you. I did not do it for you, Wolfe said plainly. I did it because Mr. Farr presumed to play chess in my library. That was Wolfe's version of sentiment. Elise stood. I'll walk Claude out. As they left, I remained behind with Wolfe, who finally reached for his cold tea and took a sip. You think that's the last we'll hear of Farr? I asked. Men like Farr do not vanish, he replied. They rebrand. I smirked. And we keep cleaning up their logos. No, Wolfe said. We simply remain a reminder that truth, like taste, cannot be faked. He set his cup down and closed his eyes. The brownstone was silent again. The balance restored, not by justice in its grandest sense, but by truth, wrapped in deduction, and delivered in Wolfe's one and only flavor, absolute. The case was over. The suspects had gone quiet. The truth had been hauled into daylight like a stained tablecloth, and Wolfe had returned to his orchids as if the whole ordeal were a passing inconvenience. Rather than a coordinated attack on his intellect, reputation, and pantry. But that's Wolfe for you. If he'd ever written an autobiography, the first line would have been, "I dislike disruption, but I dislike uncorrected errors more." He didn't solve cases to save people. He solved them because someone thought they could outthink him and he had to prove they couldn't. It was Friday morning, 2 days after the final gathering, and the brownstone was settling back into its natural rhythm. Fritz was already prepping lunch by the time I came downstairs, and the scent of tarragon and butter had begun to replace the acrid tension that had clung to the walls all week. The mail was stacked neatly beside Wolfe's chair, unread and probably unworthy, and the orchids had been misted at 6:45 sharp. I stepped into the office with my second cup of coffee, expecting a conversation about lunch or the day's newspapers. Instead, Wolfe was seated and still, reading a letter with one eyebrow slightly raised, a sure sign that whatever was on the page was either insulting, amusing, or both. "What is it?" I asked. He held it up without comment. It was a handwritten note from Claude Greaves Dotmer. "Wolfe, I don't have the words to thank you properly. I know you didn't do it for me. I know you didn't even like me, but you did it anyway. You saw through them when no one else did. I started a new place next week, small restaurant, uptown. Nothing fancy, but it's a chance. I owe it to Miss Varney for believing in me, and I owe it to you for proving she wasn't wrong. They say reputation is everything in this business. I thought mine was finished. You made sure it wasn't. Respectfully, Claude." Wolfe folded the letter and placed it in the drawer. "A decent sentiment," he said, "and mercifully brief. I'll make sure he doesn't get your recipe for flattery," I said, taking a seat. "So, that's it. Claude is out. Farr is finished. Miller's probably looking for a new ladder to climb. We back to peacetime." "There is no peacetime," Wolfe said. "Only intermissions." Comforting. He picked up a second letter and opened it with surgical care. "Farr is not finished," he added. "Men like him rarely are, but he has been displaced. His name will be absent from the next round of luxury press releases. That is enough. Think. He'll try again somewhere else, undoubtedly. But he will remember this." I nodded. "And Myla? She will deny involvement. She will distance herself. Eventually, she will reinvent her role in the affair. You think she'll succeed in time?" Wolfe said. "People forget. Institutions forget. But I do not." I took a sip of coffee. "You're a real ray of sunshine." "I am consistent," he replied. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that Wolfe prefers clean, unencumbered by commentary. "I broke it, of course, you know," I said. "It wasn't just about Claude or Farr. This one hit closer." He looked at me. "Yes, they tried to reach in here." "Yes," he repeated. "That spice cabinet." "I know," he said, with finality. It wasn't just trespassing. It was symbolic. Farr hadn't just wanted to frame Claude, he wanted to unnerve Wolfe, distort his sense of precision, suggest that even the great Nero Wolfe could be manipulated if the intrusion was subtle enough. But it didn't work, because Wolfe's strength isn't just observation. It's control, controlled logic, controlled emotion. controlled space. And when you breach that space, you don't just poke the bear, you make the bear stand up. Later that day, Fritz served lunch in silence veal with a rosemary reduction, blanched asparagus, and a wild rice pilaf Wolfe had requested 2 days prior. Routine had returned, and with it, Wolfe's appetite. As he finished, he leaned back and wiped his mouth with the precision of a closing signature. "Mr. Goodwin." "Yes?" "Tell Saul to destroy the wine." I blinked. "The Alsatian Riesling, yes. I will not have it here." I chuckled. "That might be the most symbolic thing you've ever said." "I doubt that." I stood and picked up the plates. "You think Pharaoh will ever step back into the game?" I asked. "No," Wolfe said. "She has suffered too directly, and she knows her value lies in absence, not resurrection. She played it well. She survived." Wolfe corrected. "There is a difference." That was Wolfe's version of praise. He didn't admire comebacks. He admired permanence. As I took the plates into the kitchen, Fritz gave me a look that said more than words. Relief, mostly. This case had touched the brownstone in a way most didn't. It didn't just challenge Wolfe's mind. It invaded his principles, his sanctuary. And that's what made it personal. That night, after dinner, Wolfe poured himself half a glass of beer and stood for a full minute at the window. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, just watched the quiet street outside, as if ensuring no more footsteps would cross the line without permission. Then he turned, stepped back into the office, and sat in his chair. I raised an eyebrow. "Everything in order for now," he said. Then he closed his eyes, and, just like that, the brownstone exhaled. Balance restored. Curtain down.